David Johnson checked his watch as he pulled out of his mother's driveway. The visit had run longer than expected, but he didn't mind. At 72, his mom was getting slower at moving around, and he treasured every moment they spent together. The smell of her famous apple pie still lingered in his car, along with a container of leftovers she'd insisted he take home. The drive back to the city would take about an hour through mostly rural roads. David had made this trip countless times over the years, especially since his father passed away 3 years ago. He knew every twist and turn of the route, every speed limit sign, and every spot where local police like to set up their radar guns. As a federal prosecutor, David understood the importance of following traffic laws. His job required him to be above reproach in every aspect of his life. One small mistake could be used against him in court by defense attorneys looking for any reason to question his credibility. So he always drove exactly at the speed limit, used his turn signals religiously, and kept his car registration and insurance papers perfectly organized in his glove compartment. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as David drove through the small town of Millbrook. He'd driven through this same town dozens of times before without incident. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the local diner served the same menu for 30 years, and where change came slowly if it came at all. David slowed down as he approached the main street, noting the posted speed limit of 25 miles per hour. A few elderly people sat on benches outside the pharmacy, watching the occasional car drive by. Children played in a small park while their parents chatted nearby. It seemed like a peaceful, quiet community. He checked his rearview mirror out of habit and noticed a police car had appeared behind him. This wasn't unusual. Small-town officers often followed cars with out-of-state plates or unfamiliar vehicles. David's license plates showed he was from the county where the federal courthouse was located, about 50 miles away. Still, he felt a slight tension in his shoulders, the same feeling he always got when he noticed police presence. David made sure to signal well in advance before making a left turn onto the road that would take him out of town. He checked his mirrors, looked both ways, and completed the turn smoothly. The police car followed him through the turn, maintaining a distance of about 3 car lengths behind. As they left the town limits, David accelerated gradually to match the new speed limit of 45 miles per hour. He kept glancing at his speedometer to make sure he wasn't going even 1 mile over the limit. The police car continued to follow him, and David began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. After about 2 miles of being followed, David saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. His heart sank, but he wasn't particularly worried. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong. Maybe the officer just wanted to check his license and registration, or perhaps there was some issue with his taillights that he wasn't aware of. David pulled over onto the shoulder of the road and put his car in park. He turned off the engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen, and waited. These were precautions his father had taught him years ago, lessons that had become even more important as he'd grown older and more aware of how these situations could escalate quickly. The officer approached the driver's side window with deliberate, heavy steps. David could see him in his side mirror, a white man who appeared to be in his 40s, with a stern expression and mirrored sunglasses despite the fading daylight. "License and registration," the officer said curtly as David rolled down his window. There was no greeting, no explanation for the stop, just a demand. "Good evening, officer," David replied politely. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" The officer's expression hardened. "Just give me your license and registration. Don't ask questions." David reached slowly for his wallet, announcing his movements as he'd been taught. "I'm reaching for my wallet now. My registration is in the glove compartment." As David handed over his documents, the officer examined them with unnecessary scrutiny. He held the license up to the light, compared the photo to David's face multiple times, and spent several minutes looking at the registration as if he'd never seen one before. "Where are you coming from?" the officer asked. "I was visiting my mother," David replied honestly. "She lives here in town. What's your business here?" "You don't look like you're from around here." The question struck David as odd. Since when did visiting one's mother require explaining one's business? But he answered calmly, "Like I said, I was visiting my mother. She's lived here for over 30 years. The officer walked back to his patrol car, taking David's documents with him. David watched in his rearview mirror as the officer spent an unusually long time running his information. A routine license check typically took just a few minutes, but this was stretching on much longer. While he waited, David thought about his mother's stories of moving to Millbrook decades ago. She'd chosen the town because it seemed safe and quiet, a good place to raise children, but she'd also mentioned over the years how she sometimes felt like an outsider, how some people in town had never quite accepted her family as true locals. Finally, the officer returned to David's window. "Do you know why I stopped you?" "No, sir, I don't. I was careful to follow all traffic laws." "You failed to signal when you turned onto Maple Street." David was confused. He distinctly remembered signaling for that turn. He always signaled, sometimes even when no other cars were around. It was such an ingrained habit that he would have noticed if he'd forgotten. "Officer, I'm certain I used my turn signal. I always do." "Are you calling me a liar?" The officer's voice rose slightly, and David could sense the situation becoming more tense. "No, sir. I'm just saying that I believe I did signal. Perhaps you didn't see it, or maybe my signal isn't working properly." The officer's jaw tightened. "Your signal is working fine. I watched you turn without signaling. That's a violation of traffic law." David knew better than to argue further. In his years as a prosecutor, he'd seen how quickly roadside disputes could escalate. The smart thing to do was accept the ticket, even if it was unfair, and deal with it later through proper legal channels. "I understand, officer. Will I be receiving a citation?" "You bet you will." The officer walked back to his car to write the ticket, muttering something under his breath that David couldn't quite hear but didn't sound friendly. 20 minutes later, David was handed a citation for failure to signal. The fine was listed as $150 plus court costs. The officer gave him a court date 3 weeks away and told him he could either pay the fine by mail or appear in court to contest it. As David drove away, he felt a mixture of frustration and sadness. He knew he'd done nothing wrong, and he suspected that his skin color had played a role in how he'd been treated. But he also knew that proving bias in a traffic stop was nearly impossible. By the time he reached home, David had made his decision. He would contest the ticket, not because of the money but because the principle mattered. As someone who worked within the justice system every day, he couldn't let this kind of behavior go unchallenged, even in a small-town court. 3 weeks later, David found himself driving back to Millbrook for his court appearance. He'd taken the morning off from work, something that required careful scheduling given his heavy caseload at the federal prosecutor's office. His colleagues had been supportive when he explained the situation, with several sharing their own stories of questionable traffic stops. The night before, David had prepared his case carefully. He'd driven the same route and timed how long his turn signal had been on before making the turn onto Maple Street. He'd also researched the local traffic laws to make sure he understood exactly what was required. As a prosecutor, he knew the importance of being thoroughly prepared, even for something as simple as a traffic ticket. David chose his clothes carefully that morning. He wanted to look respectable but not overdressed for a small-town municipal court. He settled on dark slacks, a button-down shirt, and a conservative tie. No suit jacket, that might seem too formal and potentially intimidating to a small-town judge who might not appreciate big city lawyers. The courthouse was a modest brick building that also housed the town's administrative offices. David arrived 30 minutes early, wanting to get a feel for the environment and observe how other cases were handled. The parking lot was already half full, mostly with older cars and pickup trucks. Inside, the building smelled like old coffee and floor wax. The municipal court was on the second floor, up a narrow staircase with worn carpeting. A hand-painted sign pointed the way to Courtroom A. David climbed the stairs, noting how the building creaked with each step. The courtroom was smaller than any David had ever worked in during his federal career. About 30 folding chairs faced a raised platform where the judge's bench sat. The whole room couldn't have been more than 400 square feet. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glare over the faded yellow walls. David took a seat in the back row and watched as other defendants began to arrive. Most were local residents, judging by their casual clothes and the way they seemed to know each other. Several people greeted each other with waves and quiet conversations about family members and local events. A middle-aged woman who appeared to be the court clerk sat at a small desk to the right of the judge's bench. She was organizing papers and checking a list of names. Occasionally, she would call out to someone in the room to confirm their presence or ask them to sign paperwork. As the room filled up, David noticed something that made him uncomfortable. Of the roughly 20 people waiting for their cases to be heard, he was one of only 3 African Americans. The others were an elderly woman who seemed to be there for a parking ticket, and a young man who looked nervous and kept checking his phone. At exactly 9 o'clock, a bailiff who looked like he might also serve as the building's janitor called for everyone to stand. Judge William Crawford entered from a side door behind the bench. He was a white man who appeared to be in his early 60s, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a black robe that looked like it had seen better days. "Be seated," the judge said without ceremony. His voice carried easily through the small room, and David noted that he seemed to survey the crowd with a practiced eye, as if he recognized most of the faces. The first few cases moved quickly. A parking violation, dismissed after the defendant explained she'd been loading groceries for her disabled mother. A speeding ticket where the defendant pleaded guilty and paid the fine without argument. A case involving a broken tail light that was dismissed when the defendant showed proof of repair. Judge Crawford seemed fair enough during these early cases, though David noticed he was more patient and understanding with defendants who appeared to be local residents. When the elderly woman with the parking ticket told her story about helping her disabled mother, the judge smiled and called her Mrs. Peterson, clearly knowing her personally. "Next case," the clerk called out. "The State versus David Johnson. Failure to signal." David stood and walked to the front of the courtroom. He could feel the eyes of everyone behind him, and he tried to project confidence without appearing arrogant. As he approached the bench, he noticed that Judge Crawford's demeanor seemed to shift slightly. The friendly expression he'd worn during the previous cases was replaced by a more neutral, businesslike look. "Mr. Johnson," the judge said, consulting the paperwork in front of him, "you're charged with failure to signal before making a turn." "How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." The judge looked up from his papers for the first time since David had approached the bench. "Not guilty? Officer Mitchell's report says he clearly observed you fail to signal before turning onto Maple Street." "Your Honor, I respectfully disagree with that assessment. I believe I did signal properly, and I'd like the opportunity to present my case." Judge Crawford leaned back in his chair and studied David for a moment. "Mr. Johnson, are you represented by counsel?" "No, Your Honor, I'm representing myself." "I see." The judge's tone suggested this was somehow unusual or problematic. "Mr. Johnson, this is a simple traffic violation. Officer Mitchell is a trained law enforcement professional with 12 years of experience. If he says you didn't signal, then you didn't signal. These cases aren't complicated." David felt his stomach tighten, but he maintained his composure. "Your Honor, I understand that Officer Mitchell is experienced, but people can make mistakes. I'd like to present evidence that I did signal properly." "Evidence?" The judge's eyebrows rose. "What evidence could you possibly have for a traffic violation?" "Your Honor, I've researched the relevant traffic laws, and I've also retraced my route to verify the timing and visibility of turn signals at that intersection. I believe there may have been a misunderstanding about what Officer Mitchell observed." Several people in the courtroom shifted in their seats. David could hear whispers behind him, though he couldn't make out what was being said. The young man who had been checking his phone earlier was now staring at David with obvious interest. Judge Crawford removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, taking his time before responding. "Mr. Johnson, let me explain something to you. This is not federal court. This is not some big city courtroom where lawyers come in with fancy presentations and technical arguments. This is Millbrook Municipal Court, and we deal with facts, not theories." The judge's words stung, but David kept his expression neutral. "I understand that. Your Honor, I'm simply asking for the opportunity to present my side of the case. Your side of the case is that you think you're smarter than a police officer who saw what happened with his own eyes. Is that correct?" David realized he was being backed into a corner, but he couldn't back down now. "Your Honor, I'm not questioning Officer Mitchell's intelligence or training. I'm simply saying that in this particular instance I believe there was an error in his observation." The judge put his glasses back on and looked down at the paperwork again. "Mr. Johnson, I've been presiding over this court for 18 years. I've heard every excuse, every story, every technical argument that people think will get them out of a traffic ticket. What I haven't heard is a lot of people taking responsibility for their actions. David felt the conversation slipping away from him, but he tried one more approach. Your Honor, I take full responsibility for my actions. That's exactly why I'm here. I believe I followed the traffic laws correctly, and I want to make sure the record reflects what actually happened. The record will reflect what Officer Mitchell observed, the judge said firmly, and what he observed was a failure to signal. Unless you have witnesses or video evidence to contradict his testimony, I'm not interested in your theories about timing and visibility. David knew he didn't have witnesses or video evidence. He'd hoped that a reasonable explanation and his demonstrated knowledge of the law would be enough to at least raise doubt about the citation. But he was learning that small-town justice operated by different rules than he was used to. No. Your Honor, I don't have witnesses or video evidence. Then we're done here. Judge Crawford made a note on the paperwork. The court finds you guilty of failure to signal. The fine is $150 plus court costs of $45. You can pay the clerk on your way out. David felt a surge of frustration, but he knew better than to argue with a judge's ruling in open court. Thank you, Your Honor. As he turned to leave, David heard the judge call the next case. The defendant was a young white man who had been charged with speeding. As David walked toward the back of the courtroom, he heard Judge Crawford's tone become noticeably more patient and understanding as he listened to the young man's explanation about being late for work. David paid his fine to the clerk, who seemed surprised that he didn't argue or complain about the amount. As he walked out of the courthouse, he felt defeated but not broken. He'd learned something important about how justice worked in small towns, and he suspected this experience would make him a better prosecutor when dealing with defendants who claimed they'd been treated unfairly. But he also couldn't shake the feeling that his race had played a role in how he'd been treated. The contrast between Judge Crawford's patience with local white defendants and his dismissive attitude toward David had been too obvious to ignore. David had barely begun to explain his understanding of the traffic laws when Judge Crawford cut him off with an impatient wave of his hand. The gesture was so dismissive that several people in the courtroom turned to look at each other with raised eyebrows. Mr. Johnson, I've heard enough, the judge declared, though David had spoken for less than 2 minutes. You came here thinking you could talk your way out of a traffic ticket with some fancy legal language. David felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice steady. Your Honor, I was simply trying to explain what happened from my perspective. Your perspective? Judge Crawford leaned forward, his voice taking on a harder edge. Let me tell you what I see from my perspective. I see someone who thinks the rules don't apply to him, someone who believes he can come into my courtroom and bamboozle me with a bunch of technical talk. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Even the clerk had stopped shuffling papers and was staring at the exchange with obvious discomfort. David could feel the weight of everyone's attention, and he sensed that something was going very wrong, beyond just losing a traffic case. Your Honor, I assure you that's not my intention. I have great respect for this court and for the law. Judge Crawford snorted. Respect for the law? If you had respect for the law, you would have signaled before making your turn. If you had respect for the law, you would have paid your fine without wasting this court's time. David tried to maintain his composure, but the judge's tone was becoming increasingly hostile. Your Honor, I believe every citizen has the right to contest a citation they believe is incorrect. Rights, the judge repeated, shaking his head. Everyone comes in here talking about their rights. You know what you don't hear much about anymore? Responsibility. Taking ownership of your mistakes. The judge's voice was rising, and David realized that this was no longer just about a traffic violation. Something deeper was happening here. Something that made him profoundly uncomfortable. Your Honor, I do take responsibility for my actions. That's exactly why I'm here. I want to make sure the record is accurate. Judge Crawford stood up abruptly, his chair rolling back and hitting the wall behind the bench with a loud thud. The record is accurate, Mr. Johnson. Officer Mitchell is a respected member of this community who has served faithfully for 12 years. Are you seriously suggesting that he would lie about what he saw? No, Your Honor, I'm not suggesting anyone is lying. I'm simply saying that mistakes can happen, and I believe one happened in this case. Mistakes. The judge walked to the front of his bench, looking down at David from his elevated position. Let me tell you about mistakes, Mr. Johnson. The mistake is thinking you can come into my town, break our laws, and then talk your way out of the consequences. David felt a chill run down his spine. The phrase "my town and our laws" seemed loaded with meaning that went beyond simple municipal authority. He glanced around the courtroom and saw that some of the local residents were nodding in agreement with the judge's words. "Your Honor, I wasn't trying to break any laws. I was visiting my mother, who has lived in this community for over 30 years. "I don't care if your mother has lived here for 100 years, Judge Crawford snapped. "That doesn't give you the right to ignore traffic laws or waste this court's time with frivolous arguments." The judge returned to his seat and picked up his pen, making notes on David's case file. "These people always think they're above the law," he muttered, just loud enough for the courtroom to hear clearly. David's stomach dropped. The phrase "these people" hung in the air like a toxic cloud. He looked around the courtroom again and saw a mix of reactions. Some people looked uncomfortable and were staring at their hands. Others seemed to approve of the judge's comments. The elderly African-American woman in the front row was shaking her head sadly. "Furthermore," Judge Crawford continued, his voice returning to its official tone but retaining its hostile edge, "this court does not appreciate defendants who come in here trying to show off their education or make the rest of us feel stupid." David hadn't mentioned his education or tried to show off anything. He'd simply tried to present a logical argument for his innocence. But he realized that his manner of speaking, his vocabulary, and perhaps even his choice of clothing had been interpreted as some kind of challenge to the judge's authority. "Your Honor, I never intended to show off or make anyone feel uncomfortable. I was simply trying to present my case clearly." "Your case is clear enough," the judge said. "You violated traffic law, you got caught, and now you want to argue about it instead of accepting responsibility. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." David felt the unfairness of the situation washing over him like a wave. Every word he spoke seemed to make things worse. But staying silent felt like accepting an injustice that went far beyond a simple traffic ticket. "Your Honor, I respectfully disagree with your assessment of my character, based on my desire to contest what I believe was an incorrect citation." Judge Crawford's face reddened. "You respectfully disagree? Mr. Johnson, you are in my courtroom and you will show proper respect for this court's authority. Your attitude is exactly the problem we see too often these days." The judge stood up again and began pacing behind the bench. "People come in here thinking they know better than everyone else, thinking they're smarter than police officers, smarter than judges, smarter than the system that has worked in this town for decades." David realized that any further argument would only make things worse, but the judge wasn't finished. "You know what this community values, Mr. Johnson? Honesty, hard work, respect for authority, taking responsibility when you make a mistake. These are simple concepts that apparently aren't so simple for everyone to understand." The not-so-subtle implications in the judge's words were becoming clearer with each sentence. David felt like he was trapped in a nightmare where every attempt to defend himself only proved his guilt in the judge's eyes. "I'm going to teach you about responsibility, Mr. Johnson," Judge Crawford announced. "The original fine for failure to signal is $150. However, given your attitude in this courtroom and your complete lack of respect for the law, I'm increasing that fine to $500. Gasps could be heard from several people in the courtroom. Even some of the locals seemed surprised by the severity of the penalty for a simple traffic violation. Additionally, the judge continued, "Court costs will be $275, bringing your total to $775. David felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. The fine had been increased by more than 5 times the original amount, and the court costs were absurdly high for a municipal court case. "Your Honor, that seems like an excessive penalty for a first-time traffic violation." "Excessive?" Judge Crawford's voice rose again. "What's excessive is your refusal to accept responsibility. What's excessive is your disrespectful attitude toward this court. What's excessive is thinking you can come into this community and act like the rules don't apply to you." The judge made several more notes in David's file, writing with unnecessary force that suggested he was still angry. "Mr. Johnson, let me make something very clear. This is how we handle people who don't understand that actions have consequences. Maybe next time you'll think twice before you decide to ignore traffic laws." David stood silent, recognizing that anything he said would only make the situation worse. The judge's bias was so obvious that further argument would be pointless and potentially dangerous. "You can pay the clerk on your way out," Judge Crawford said dismissively. "And Mr. Johnson, I hope this experience teaches you something about respect and responsibility." As David turned to leave, he heard the judge call the next case in a much friendlier tone. Thompson versus the state for improper parking. Mr. Thompson, good morning. I see you're here about that parking ticket from last week. The contrast in tone was so dramatic that David wondered if he'd imagined the hostility of the previous few minutes. But the worried expressions on the faces of several courtroom observers confirmed that what had just happened was as unusual and troubling as it had felt. David walked to the clerk's desk, where the middle-aged woman avoided making eye contact as she calculated his fine. Her hands shook slightly as she prepared the paperwork, and David wondered if she'd witnessed similar scenes before. As he wrote out a check for $775, David realized that this experience had taught him something important, though probably not what Judge Crawford had intended. He'd learned that bias and prejudice could operate openly in some places, protected by the authority of office and the assumption that no one would challenge it. But David also knew something that Judge Crawford didn't know yet. This story was far from over. David stood at the clerk's desk writing out his check for $775 when he made a decision that would change everything. The injustice of what had just happened burned in his chest, but he also recognized an opportunity to make a point that might prevent other people from experiencing the same treatment. The clerk, whose nameplate read Beverly Martinez, was clearly uncomfortable as she processed his payment. Her hands trembled slightly as she stamped the paperwork, and she kept glancing toward the judge's bench where Judge Crawford was now dealing with the next case in a markedly different tone. Mr. Thompson, I see this parking ticket was issued right in front of Miller's hardware store, the judge was saying to a middle-aged white man in work clothes. Now I know that stretch of Main Street can be confusing with the parking regulations. Tell me what happened. The contrast with how David had been treated just minutes earlier was so stark that it felt surreal. Mr. Thompson was being given every opportunity to explain his situation, while David had been cut off and lectured about responsibility and respect. As Beverly handed David his receipt, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his business card. It was a simple white card with black lettering that read, David A. Johnson, Federal Prosecutor, United States Attorney's Office, Eastern District. Below his name were his office phone number, email address, and the official seal of the Department of Justice. David placed the card on the counter next to his receipt. Ma'am, would you mind giving this to Judge Crawford when he has a moment? I'd appreciate it if he could have it before I leave the building. Beverly looked down at the card, and David watched as her eyes widened when she read the text. She looked up at him with an expression of shock and something that might have been fear. Yes, sir. I'll make sure he gets this right away. David nodded politely. Thank you. I'll be in the hallway if he needs to speak with me. As David walked toward the back of the courtroom, he could hear Beverly whispering urgently to the bailiff. The bailiff, a man who looked like he'd held the job for decades, took the card from Beverly and read it himself. His reaction was even more dramatic than hers. His face went pale and he immediately looked toward David, then toward the judge. David took a seat in the back row and waited. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he was certain that Judge Crawford would want to see the card. In his experience, people who wielded power inappropriately often became very concerned when they realized they'd targeted someone who might have the authority to hold them accountable. Judge Crawford was still listening patiently to Mr. Thompson's explanation about why he'd parked in front of the hardware store. Well, Mr. Thompson, I can see how that could be confusing. His mother, when he told her about the incident, was both angry and unsurprised. David, I've lived in that town for 30 years, and I've seen how some people get treated differently than others. I've just never had anyone with your background to witness it and potentially do something about it. David's decision was made when he received an unexpected phone call 3 days after his court appearance. The caller identified herself as Monica Chen, a civil rights attorney who worked for a nonprofit organization that monitored judicial bias. Mr. Johnson, I hope you don't mind me calling. I received your name from someone who was in the Millbrook courthouse when your case was heard. I understand you had an unusual experience with Judge Crawford. David was surprised but agreed to meet with Monica to discuss what had happened. When they met for coffee the following day, Monica explained that her organization had been receiving complaints about Judge Crawford's court for several years, but they'd never had anyone with David's credentials willing to come forward. We've documented at least 15 cases over the past 3 years where African American defendants received significantly harsher penalties than white defendants for similar violations, Monica explained. But most of the people affected don't have the resources or knowledge to challenge the system. Monica showed David a file of case summaries that painted a clear picture of discriminatory sentencing patterns. Traffic violations that typically resulted in $50 fines for white defendants often carried $200 or $300 penalties for black defendants. First-time offenders from minority communities were routinely lectured about responsibility and respect for authority, while repeat white offenders often received friendly warnings and reduced penalties. The problem is that municipal court judges have broad discretion in sentencing, so it's hard to prove discrimination unless you have multiple cases to establish a pattern. Monica continued, "Your case is different because Judge Crawford's bias was so obvious, and because you have the legal background to articulate exactly what happened." David agreed to work with Monica's organization to file a formal complaint with the State Judicial Review Board. The complaint detailed not only David's experience but also the pattern of discriminatory sentencing that the civil rights organization had documented. Within 2 weeks of filing the complaint, a local newspaper picked up the story. The headline read, "Federal Prosecutor Alleges Bias in Municipal Court." The article was carefully written to avoid legal liability, but it provided enough detail for readers to understand the seriousness of the allegations. The response was immediate and polarizing. Some community members in Millbrook rallied around Judge Crawford, claiming he was being unfairly attacked by outsiders who didn't understand small-town values. Others, particularly minority residents, began sharing their own stories of questionable treatment in Crawford's court. David received dozens of phone calls and emails from people who had experienced similar treatment. A pattern emerged of excessive fines, dismissive treatment, and lectures about respect and responsibility that seemed to be reserved primarily for defendants of color. The State Judicial Review Board launched a formal investigation within a month. As part of their inquiry, they reviewed 3 years of sentencing data from Crawford's court and conducted interviews with court staff, attorneys, and defendants who had appeared before the judge. The investigation took 6 months to complete. During that time, Judge Crawford's behavior in court became noticeably more restrained. Word had spread through the legal community about the investigation, and attorneys began paying closer attention to how their clients were treated in Millbrook Municipal Court. The Judicial Review Board's final report was damning. They found clear evidence of discriminatory sentencing patterns and determined that Judge Crawford had violated multiple canons of judicial ethics. The board recommended that Crawford be removed from the bench and that the entire municipal court system in Millbrook undergo mandatory bias training. Judge Crawford initially fought the recommendation, hiring a high-profile attorney to argue that the investigation was politically motivated. But as more evidence emerged and additional complaints were filed, he eventually agreed to resign in exchange for avoiding formal removal proceedings. The changes in Millbrook went beyond just replacing the judge. The town council, faced with potential civil rights lawsuits and negative publicity, implemented new oversight procedures for the municipal court. They also established a citizen review board to monitor court proceedings and ensure fair treatment for all defendants. David was invited to speak at several legal conferences about his experience and the broader issues of bias in local courts. He found these speaking engagements both rewarding and challenging, as they forced him to articulate not just what had happened to him, but why it mattered for the justice system as a whole. "The scariest part of my experience wasn't the excessive fine or even the obvious bias," David would tell audiences. "It was realizing how many people go through the same thing every day with no recourse and no voice. If this could happen to a federal prosecutor who knew his rights and had the resources to fight back, imagine what happens to people who don't have those advantages." 6 months after Judge Crawford's resignation, David returned to Millbrook to visit his mother. As he drove through the town, he passed the courthouse where his ordeal had begun. A new sign in front of the building announced that Judge Maria Santos would be presiding over municipal court cases. David had heard good things about Judge Santos, who had a reputation for fairness and community engagement. During his visit with his mother, David learned that the changes in the court system had been noticed throughout the community. Beverly Martinez, the former court clerk, had been promoted to court administrator and was working to implement new procedures that would ensure equal treatment for all defendants. "You know," his mother said as they sat on her porch that evening, "some people in town weren't happy about what you did. They thought you were making trouble where none existed." David nodded. He'd expected that reaction. "But," his mother continued, "there are a lot of other people who are grateful. People who never thought anyone would listen to their complaints or take their experiences seriously. You gave them a voice." As David drove home that night, he reflected on how a simple traffic stop had turned into a lesson about justice, privilege, and the responsibility that comes with having a platform to speak out against injustice. He thought about all the people who had shared their stories with him over the past year, and about the changes that had resulted from his decision to fight an unfair traffic ticket. The $775 he'd paid for his citation had turned out to be an investment in something much more valuable than just clearing his record. It had purchased a spotlight that illuminated a problem many people preferred to ignore, and it had created an opportunity for meaningful change in a system that had been failing people for years. David still had the receipt from his fine, tucked away in a file folder in his office. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never intended to fight, and that standing up for principle often costs more than staying silent, but creates value that far exceeds the price paid. The story of what happened in Millbrook Municipal Court had become a case study in several law schools, an example of how individual courage can challenge systemic problems and create lasting change. But for David, the most meaningful outcome was simpler: the knowledge that other people facing similar situations would now have a better chance of receiving fair treatment, regardless of their race, background, or ability to fight back. Justice, David had learned, wasn't just about following laws and procedures. It was about ensuring that those laws and procedures were applied equally to everyone, and about having the courage to speak up when they weren't. His experience in Judge Crawford's courtroom had been painful and frustrating, but it had also been transformative, not just for him but for an entire community and the many people who would benefit from the changes that followed.